Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 8 of the Bible and Science. Up to now, we've been focusing on the Bible. Now we're going to shift a little bit and start talking about science. In particular, I want to talk about scientific methodology. You've probably heard of the scientific method. There's no one scientific method that you have to follow all of the time, but there are certain methods that you do. And one of the key factors in that is logic. So I've mentioned logic before, and we're going to talk about the role of logic in scientific methodology. So remember, we've covered before what it means to know something. You may say that you know, and it's because you have personal experience through your senses. I know that a bee sting hurts because I've gotten stung. Or you may say that you know something because an authority told you, you decided to trust them. You don't remember being born, but yet here's this lady or a birth certificate or something that says this is when you were born, and you say, okay, I guess so, even though you don't remember it. And I know the sun is 93 million miles away because I read it in a bunch of books. Also, we sing, Jesus loves me, this I know, for my senses tell me so. No, for the Bible tells me so. We also know many things through logic. For instance, I have never personally counted 2 trillion things and 2 trillion other things to make sure that they really add up to 4 trillion, but logically, that works. And then also, we'll talk about this a little later, I know I have a brain even though I've never personally seen or felt my brain. You may also know, based on feeling or intuition, when you meet the love of your life, you don't need to test it somehow. You don't need anybody to tell you. You just know that's the one for you. Or if God's called you to the ministry or something like that, you know it. Now, others may confirm it for you, but you just know it. Then there's also 2 other things that really have nothing to do with science. People pretend they're knowledge, but they really aren't. One of them would be wishful thinking. You go to the store that sells lottery tickets and you say, I want to give this money to my state because I love my state so much. No, what you're telling yourself is that I just know this is going to be the winning lottery numbers. So you buy the tickets, give the money to the state. Wishful thinking. You also, many times, you bluff. In sports, for instance, you try to persuade somebody for an ulterior motive. Your team plans to run the ball to the right, so you try to make them think you're going to pass it to the left. If you're in a poker game, you try to make somebody think you have a better hand than you do. You want to sell something, you try to persuade them that it's better than it really is. Or if you're a paleoanthropologist and your job is to find ape men bones, and you go out into the wilderness and you find a bone and your funding is about to be cut off, so you say, I know this bone is from an ape man, and you try to persuade others. The ones that are valid parts of science, though, is your senses, authority, and logic. Your feeling is wonderful for you, but that's for you only. That's not for me. My feeling is not for you. So when we're dealing with science, scientific methodology starts out by you noticing something. Your senses bring something to your attention in nature. What do you want to know? For instance, you might say, well, does music affect how plants grow? Or you might say, why is the grass green? Or why is the sky blue? Your senses had given you some phenomena to think about, and so you decide, let me investigate this. Now, if you just start doing an experiment without gathering information about the subject, you're dumb. You're wasting a lot of time. There have been so many studies done on so many topics, you may save a lot of time. For instance, suppose you want to know everything there is to know about the life cycle of the Malaysian tree frog. You can move to the jungles of Malaysia and live out there for 40 years and watch the tree frogs, or You could do some preliminary work and read up what other people have done and maybe save yourself about 10 or 15 years. So if you don't gather information about the subject, you're really wasting your time. I had a student one time said that she didn't want to go out and get her opinions colored by what others have done. She didn't get a very good grade at all. So once you've gathered information, then you say, okay, I think I see what's going on here, and you formulate a hypothesis. You're using logic, which we'll talk about in detail. And then you find a way to test your hypothesis logically to see if it makes sense. And then you perform the test and you observe the result. You're using your senses. Then you draw a conclusion using inductive logic and you report your results so that others can repeat the test. Others will then use your work. You will become the authority for them, for their work that follows later. So, can we test everything scientifically? Well, prove to me scientifically that you love your mama. You can't. There are some things you can't test. There are other things you can test. So the kinds of things you can test scientifically would be observable trends and tendencies in nature, the laws of nature, the law of gravity, planetary motion, and so forth. Observable processes going on right now, and processes and events that left direct evidence. For instance, we can know some things about the structure of dinosaur bones because we have dinosaur bones. That's the evidence. We don't have anything about the behavior of the dinosaurs, but we do have the bone structure. So those things we can probably do some scientific testing on. Other types of things you can't do any scientific testing on. How did the universe start? Did somebody do it? Was it all random? Does it mean anything? Why did God do this if God did this? You can't test that. And then, well, is this right or wrong? Is it morally evil, morally good? What does it all mean? You can't test that scientifically. You also can't specifically test the details. I believe what the Bible says about the first man being Adam, the first woman being Eve, but I can't test that. What did they wear? Did they like to eat? Did the fruit they ate in the garden taste good? There's no way we could test that. But I want to focus on the things that we can test. So I've spoken before to school boards about this, that if somebody wants to examine the creation evolution controversy, that does not have to be a religious question. You can use it for educational advantage. For instance, from an educational perspective, it's not necessary for students to make up their minds about whether creation or evolution makes more sense. What they could do is have their curiosity stimulated. It's a very emotional topic, and people, young people, are going to get curious. So the teacher's job can be to help them develop the skills necessary to evaluate all sides of a controversial issue, such as this one. And there are many other controversial issues. If you've learned to examine all sides of a controversy, you're going to do much better. Isn't that what good education is supposed to be? To teach the students how to think rather than what to think. So does the origins controversy automatically have to be religious? There are certainly religious aspects. You have Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the creation, the sin, and all of that. Yeah, that's religious. There's no question about that. But you could just bypass the religious aspects entirely and look at the scientific aspects. What were the conditions at the beginning of the earth? Have things improved? Have they become more complex, or have they deteriorated? Have they become less complex? So what sort of development has taken place since then? Simple to complex, which is what evolution says, or complex to simple, which is what creation says. So if you ignore the religious questions, students can learn a great deal from studying the scientific questions, with the purpose not being to teach religion, but to enhance the effectiveness of science education, teaching them how to think, not what to think. So we're going to be looking at evidence in our science classes. Well, what is evidence? Suppose that there's a murder trial and the accused is sitting there, and the prosecuting attorney brings forth a gun and says, "Your Honor, here's People's Exhibit A. The accused purchased this gun 2 years ago, and it was used in a robbery, and a person was killed using this gun, and we have the forensics and all of these sort of things." Oh, and you say, this guy's guilty. But then the defense attorney comes up, picks up exactly the same gun, and says, "Your Honor, my client filed a report with the police a year ago saying this gun had been stolen. It has not been in his possession for the last year." And now you're sitting there thinking, "Oh, wait, they're railroading this guy. They're framing him." What's the evidence? A gun. Was he guilty or was he not guilty? That's the interpretation of the evidence. Those are two entirely different things. It's possible if you have certain evidence that there may be more than one interpretation for it, maybe many interpretations. And it's also possible that your interpretation is wrong and mine is wrong. Maybe every interpretation is wrong. We just don't know. We have to look and see what's the most reasonable answer, but we can't absolutely say anything is proven based upon just evidence. Evidence has to be interpreted. So let's talk about the creation evolution issue. Here's a question for you if you're a skeptic. What scientific evidence for creation are you prepared to accept? What will you accept as evidence for creation? You say, "I don't know." If you don't know what you're looking for, how are you going to know when it hits you in the face? You have to have some idea of what you're looking for. And when it comes to creation and evolution, the basic framework for creation is complex to simple. For evolution, the basic framework is simple to complex. So you have to decide, am I willing to accept this as evidence for creation or for evolution? If you don't know what you're looking for, how are you going to recognize it when you see it? And I also hope that you'll recognize that you are biased, at least to a certain extent. So let's say I show you this phrase, and if you ever took a typing class, I'm sure you're familiar with that, with this sentence. And I'm going to let you look at it for a couple of seconds, and then I'm going to blank it out and ask you to think about what it said. Okay, 1, 2, a couple seconds. So what did it say? Most people are going to say it said, "Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country." If you said that, you're biased. What? You've already got some preconceptions in your mind. I'm going to show it to you now, and we'll go over it word by word. It says, "Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country." But if you looked at that and said, "Oh, yeah, that's the familiar sentence, now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country," you missed it. Some evidence hit you in the eyeballs and came into your brain through your optic nerve, and you weren't paying attention because you were biased. Many times we have certain expectations, and based on those expectations, we reach conclusions that may be right or may be wrong. So this is why there's peer review in science, because everybody is biased to a certain extent. And so if you let your peers evaluate your work, then they're much more likely to be able to catch the bias in your own work. And I want to reiterate my example a few minutes ago with a trial where there's a gun. If I pick up that gun and the other attorney picks up that gun, we're looking at exactly the same piece of evidence. So if we're dealing with the creation evolution controversy, I pick up a bone from an Edmontosaurus. An evolutionist picks up the same bone from an Edmontosaurus. I look at the light coming into my telescope. An evolutionary biased astronomer looks at the same light coming in through the telescope I look at a mixture of radioactive and non-radioactive elements in a rock. Somebody else looks at the same rock. The evidence is exactly the same. We just interpret it according to our biases. And we're going to get in detail into what the biases are probably in the next lesson. So when we're dealing with the prehistoric past, for instance, in the creation evolution controversy, what living person can say, I was there and I saw what happened? Nobody. Well, do we have any eyewitness accounts from ancient times? The only one that claims to be an eyewitness account is the Bible. If you reject the Bible, you'd say, well, that's unacceptable. If you accept the Bible, you'd say, oh, okay, this is God's eyewitness account. But let's say we're not going to use the Bible right now. So how do we know about the beginning? Remember, you can know through your senses, through an authority, or through logic. So let's consider logic in science and then later in the origins controversy. Up until the Middle Ages, what passed for science was actually the deductive logic of the ancient Greeks. They believed that logic would always lead to truth. Testing was unimportant to them. The most famous Greek philosopher was Aristotle, and we still talk about Aristotelian logic, because of the fact that his student was Alexander the Great, who conquered much of the known world. Aristotelian logic spread, and it was taught as fact for about 2,000 years throughout Europe, West Asia, and North Africa. So people put a bumper sticker on their car saying, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. Well, back then it was more like Aristotle said it, I believe it, and that settles it. So Aristotle didn't care about testing. He was interested only in logical ideas, what had to be the conclusion, what necessarily sprang from the phenomena he could observe. So these are some of the things that Aristotle said that turns out to be incorrect, but people accepted these for 2,000 years because Aristotle was so famous and he was so credible. So the first thing Aristotle said was that the Earth was the center of the solar system. Well, this first began to be falsified in the early 1100s, 1200s, and so forth. And Copernicus mathematically showed that no, that doesn't work. It works much easier if we put the sun at the center of the solar system. Not the universe, but the center of the solar system. So nobody had questioned up until that time what Aristotle had said. And then Aristotle also said that heavier objects always fall faster. That's obvious, isn't it? You drop a feather in a cannonball, well, the cannonball is heavier, it's going to fall faster. The first person that found a good way to test this rigorously was Galileo. He was living in the city of Pisa, Italy, and he went up to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, brought 3 cannonballs, 2 were chained together, one was by itself, and he said in Italian, I don't know how you would say this, look out below! And he pushed a single cannonball off at the same time as a double cannonball. Double cannonball weighed twice as much, but it fell at exactly the same rate. Uh-oh. What was Aristotle overlooking? Air resistance. Air resistance is negligible with something like a cannonball. And this has even been tested on the moon, where somebody dropped a feather and a hammer at the same time, and there's no atmosphere on the moon, so there was no air resistance, and the feather fell at the same rate as the hammer. Aristotle also said that all objects possess an innate tendency to come to rest. They'll reach their natural position and then they'll stop. Well, that's not really true. Newton started out with a thought experiment, and this has been tested many times. If you have a rough object like a ball, and it's got a lot of roughness on its surface, roll it along the ground. It'll go so far and stop. Well, now smooth it down and smooth what it's rolling on. Oh, it goes further. Keep smoothing the ball, keep smoothing the surface. It would go forever, theoretically. So Aristotle had been overlooking friction. And then Aristotle also contradicted this poor guy Democritus, who lived around the same time as he did. Democritus said there has to be some level. For instance, if I take a chunk of gold and cut it in half, it's still gold. Cut it in half, it's still gold. Cut it in half, it's still gold. There has to be some level where if I cut it one more time, it's not gold anymore. Aristotle said in Greek, however you do that, no, you stupid. So poor Democritus, he was overruled because the master, Aristotle, said he was wrong. It took up until about the 1800s for Dalton to revive the atomic theory and show, and this has been confirmed, we actually now have the technology where we can see individual atoms. But because Aristotle was so famous, he was so highly regarded, he stopped science in many areas for thousands of years. So in science, logic is part of it. Observation is a really important part. But there are two main types of logic in science. Now, I'm not talking about formal and informal where you're dealing with the structure. The nature of the types of logic. One of them is inductive. You look at a great many phenomena and try to discover a pattern that points to a general principle. So, for instance, every year when I was teaching, I live in the New Orleans area, and in August it was hot. But I would tell the students every year it's going to be nice in October. The weather is going to cool down, and by the middle of October it's going to be very pleasant. And they say, how do you know that? Because I had been through 60 some Octobers, and so that was the pattern. Inductive logic is trying to determine the most reasonable, that is, the most likely conclusion. That's the heart of the scientific method. Now, we also have something called deductive logic. Instead of science, this is at the root of mathematics. So we start with general principles accepted as true, and we apply them to specific cases. Deductive logic tries to establish absolute truth. That is, the conclusion must be true, by comparison to inductive, where we're looking at the most reasonable explanation, the answer that makes the most sense. So we say this must be true in deductive logic. So the conclusions of inductive logic, where we look at many examples before we come up with a general principle, they result from an examination of observable phenomena. It's after we observed, which is posterior, so we call this a posteriori logic. These conclusions are testable. Doesn't mean they're proven. The only thing that's absolutely proven in science is that nothing in science is absolutely proven. But then the other type of logic, deductive logic, you take something that you say, this has to be true, it's just automatic. Those are called premises. They may come from inductive conclusions, or they may just be statements accepted as self-evident, that is, a priori. We say this before we examine any evidence. A priori statements, premises in deductive logic are not necessarily the result of testing. So back to the question, how do you know you have a brain? Well, this is where we're going to use both types of logic, inductive logic and deductive logic. Inductive logic, every living human being examined so far has had a brain. If one were ever found without a brain, it would be front page news. So therefore, after examining the evidence, we reach the a posteriori conclusion, all humans have a brain. That's through inductive logic. Deductive logic, we're now going to use that conclusion, all humans have a brain, as an a priori premise to set up the following. All humans have a brain, I'm a human, therefore I must have a brain. Well, we're starting as absolute truth with the statement that all humans have a brain. What would it take to falsify that? This is a structure that's used most commonly in logic. It says if a first statement is true, then a second statement is true. That's accepted. That's a major premise. And then we say, well, the first statement is true. And that's the minor premise. And then we conclude, well, therefore, the second statement must be true. That's the conclusion. So you can represent it graphically by having an inner circle and an outer circle. The if part goes inside the inner circle. The then part goes inside the outer circle. You can also chain these. For instance, since I've been living in the New Orleans area, I could say, if I live in New Orleans, then I live in Louisiana. True. Or I could say, then I live in the U.S. And I could then say, then I live on Earth. And I could then say, I live in the solar system. All of this because I live in New Orleans. It doesn't mean I can reverse it. I can't say because I live on Earth, therefore I live in New Orleans. No, there's a lot of other places besides just New Orleans. So you can chain the syllogisms, but you have to be very careful about reversing things. This is called a converse. Suppose I make a statement to you, if I'm at Mount Everest, then I'm at the highest mountain in the world. That is a true statement. I turn it around into the converse. I reverse the if and then part. If I'm at the highest mountain in the world, then I'm at Mount Everest. That is also true. So this is correct because there's an exact one-to-one match between the if and then part. It's called a biconditional. That is completely reliable if there's an exact one-to-one match. What if there's not? If I say, if I'm at Victoria Falls, then I'm at one of the largest waterfalls in the world, that's true. But if I turn it around into the converse and I say, if I'm at one of the largest waterfalls in the world, then I'm at Victoria Falls, that's not necessarily so. There are many other waterfalls. If there's more than one possibility, then a converse is not reliable. So using a diagram, we can see if I'm at Victoria Falls or Niagara Falls or Angel Falls or Kayatur or some other one, any one of those, I'm at one of the largest waterfalls. I can't turn it around and say if I'm at one of the largest waterfalls, then automatically I must be at Angel Falls or wherever. No, you can't turn it around. Okay, this is where evolution uses very, very poor, incorrect logic. It's correct to say if I'm at Victoria Falls, I'm at one of the largest waterfalls. It's not correct to say if I'm at one of the largest waterfalls, then I'm at Victoria. No, it's not reliable. Okay, this is how it relates to the creation evolution controversy. I've heard the statement, it seems ridiculously improbable that something as complex as a horse could have evolved, but they're horses, so they had to evolve. Well, you're assuming there's only one possible explanation. But putting it in evolutionary terms, if evolution is true, then the universe and life would exist, which I agree. Even though I don't believe in it, I agree that would be correct. Turn it around into the converse. If the universe and life exist, then evolution is true. That's not reliable. It's a false statement. And I'll show you graphically in just a moment. But all teaching of evolution only in schools relies on the invalid use of a logical converse. So using a diagram, the universe exists. Why? Well, if atheistic evolution is correct, that would explain the universe. If theistic evolution is correct, that would explain it. If young Earth creation is correct, that would explain it. If old Earth creation is correct, that would explain it. There may be something else that we just never thought about. Any of those could be the possible explanation for the origin of the universe. You can't turn it around and say, because the universe exists, therefore theistic evolution or young Earth creation is correct. No, this is where you have to look at the evidence and try to find out which is the most reasonable, most logical explanation. So back to how do you know you have a brain? Using inductive logic, we've thought about every living human examined so far has had a brain. If there was one found without a brain, it'd be one front page news. There was an instance that happened some years ago where a little baby boy was born with only a brain stem, and it was stunning that he was even alive. Well, a brain stem is part of a brain, and later on, more of the brain grew in, and he can function pretty normally now. But if he hadn't even had a brain stem, that is no brain whatsoever, we figure he would have been dead. So since everybody we've examined has had some portion of a brain, therefore we reach the a posteriori conclusion, all humans have a brain. Now, using deductive logic, use that conclusion as an a priori premise to set up the following. All humans have a brain. I am a human. Therefore, I must have a brain. Yeah, but if even one living human were found without a brain, maybe you don't have one either. So it can be falsified. Inductive logic is looking for a general pattern, and we can never say it's absolutely proven. Deductive logic could have some problems too. Even if we have correct logic, correct structure, false premises can lead to false conclusions. For instance, suppose I tell you all dogs bark, or if an animal is a dog, then it barks, and then I tell you Fido is a dog. What conclusion do you have to reach? Therefore, Fido must bark. Is that necessarily so? Well, suppose Fido had throat surgery. Suppose he had laryngitis. Suppose he was bashful. Or suppose he's a member of the Basenji breed of Africa. The Basenjis don't bark. They've been selectively bred not to bark. So even though the logic looks good, all dogs bark, Fido's a dog, therefore Fido barks, it's not reliable because my first premise was wrong. All dogs bark. So we're basing all of this upon statements that are taken as self-evident and accepted without proof. So Euclid's parallel line postulate, Euclid back in Alexandria, Egypt, made a series of 23 statements that he said this has to be true when he was explaining the nature of the universe. So his parallel line postulate said if you take any line and take another point that's not on the first line, there could only be one parallel line through a point not on the first line. What? That's the basis of Euclidean geometry. Does everybody agree on that? Well, no, as a matter of fact. Lobachevsky and Riemann, mathematicians, say, no, you don't understand. Space is not really straight. It's curved in such a manner that there's no such thing as an infinitely long straight line in the sense that we understand straight. Prove that. You can't. But the first one of them would have said space is negatively curved and there's no such thing as straight lines. So you could put an infinite number of lines through a point not on the first line you started with, and they'd be parallel according to his definition. Prove that. You can't. You just have to accept it as being self-evident. The other one says, well, space is positively curved, so there's no such thing as parallel lines. All lines intersect at infinity. Prove that. You can't. Whether you're believing in Euclidean, Lobachevskian, or Riemannian geometry, you can't prove it. You just say, this makes sense to me. So each of these three is the basis of a different version of geometry, but none can be proven. This should sound familiar to you if you've read what Thomas Jefferson wrote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He didn't say, I'm about to prove this to you. He said, this is self-evident. And that was the basis of the Declaration of Independence. So in the next episode, we'll start talking about the things that you have to believe if you want to say that evolution really is self-evident. So make sure you tune in, please.